You just said, cool, that's it. No argument, no speech, no dramatic reaction. Just two words that sounded so harmless they probably didn't even realize what happened next. And that's the funny thing about power. People expect destruction to be loud. They expect anger, revenge, shouting, some big dramatic move that announces, I'm coming for you. But real power doesn't always make noise. Sometimes you look at the person who spent months trying to provoke you, undermine you, compete with you, or prove that you were never good enough, and you simply say, cool, because you finally understood something they didn't. You don't have to fight every battle to win. You don't have to expose every lie. You don't have to answer every insult. You don't have to defend yourself against every person desperate to drag you into their little circus. Let them talk. Let them celebrate too early. Let them think your silence means weakness. Because while they're busy performing for an audience, you're quietly deciding whether they even deserve another minute of your attention. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because the moment you stop reacting, they lose control of the game. The moment you stop explaining, they lose access to your emotions. The moment you stop competing, they're suddenly competing with themselves. And then one day, they look around and realize the person they were trying so desperately to defeat isn't even playing anymore. You ever notice how badly some people need a reaction from you? They poke you, question you, mock you, challenge you, twist your words, and then sit back waiting for you to explode. That's the part they enjoy. Not the argument itself, the reaction. They want your anger because your anger gives them control. They want you emotional because emotional people are predictable. They know exactly what happens when they press the right button. You defend yourself. You explain. You raise your voice. You start proving things that never needed to be proven. And suddenly, without even realizing it, you're playing their game. Then one day, something changes. They throw the same insult. They make the same little comment. They expect the same version of you to appear. But instead, you look at them and say, cool, that's it. No paragraph. No argument. No desperate explanation. No attempt to convince them that they misunderstood you. Just cool. And suddenly, the room feels different. Because they were prepared for resistance. They were prepared for anger. They were prepared to watch you defend your position like your entire identity depended on winning that conversation. But you didn't give them anything. You didn't hand them the emotional ammunition they came looking for. And that can be terrifying to someone who built their confidence around provoking you. See, people often confuse silence with surrender because they've never experienced controlled silence. They think if you don't respond, you lost. If you don't argue, you're scared. If you walk away, you couldn't handle the pressure. That's how immature people interpret composure. They measure strength by noise because they don't understand restraint. But restraint is expensive. It requires you to have enough control over yourself to leave something unanswered. It requires you to watch someone misunderstand you without immediately correcting them. It requires you to let somebody believe they won when you know the scoreboard they're watching isn't even the real scoreboard. And that's where the game gets interesting. Because when you stop reacting, people have to reveal themselves. The person who genuinely respects you doesn't need to constantly provoke you. The person who values you doesn't need to humiliate you to feel important. But the person who needs your emotional reaction will keep pushing. They'll increase the pressure. They'll change the subject. They'll bring up something from 3 years ago. They'll involve other people. They'll make little comments disguised as jokes. Why? Because your calm is frustrating them. They're searching for the button, and you've removed the button. You say, cool, and suddenly they're standing there with all this energy and nowhere to put it. They expected you to fight for approval. You didn't. They expected you to defend your reputation. You didn't. They expected you to chase their validation. You didn't. You simply continued. And there is something almost cruel about continuing to improve while somebody else is desperately trying to interrupt your peace. You don't need to announce that you're becoming stronger. You don't need to post quotes every morning about how nobody can stop you. You don't need to tell everyone that you're entering a new era. Just become different. Let them discover it through your behavior. That's the part people underestimate. Real transformation doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like not answering the message that was designed to anger you. Sometimes it looks like refusing to gossip about the person who betrayed you. Sometimes it looks like hearing an accusation and realizing you don't owe a courtroom defense to everyone who has an opinion. You stop trying to control what people think, and that's when you become difficult to manipulate, because manipulation depends on emotional urgency. It depends on getting you to react before you think. It depends on making you feel like you must respond immediately, explain immediately, defend yourself immediately. But you learn to pause, you breathe, you look at the situation, and you ask yourself, does this actually deserve my energy? Most of the time, the answer is no. That doesn't mean you become passive. It doesn't mean you tolerate disrespect. It doesn't mean you allow people to walk over you. Sometimes you need boundaries. Sometimes you need consequences. Sometimes you need to speak clearly and leave. But there is a massive difference between responding and reacting. A reaction belongs to them. A response belongs to you. And once you understand that difference, people lose one of their favorite weapons against you. They can insult you. You can stay calm. They can doubt you. You can keep working. They can laugh at your plans. You can keep building. They can talk about you behind your back. You can keep moving. Not because you're pretending not to care, but because you finally understand that attention is a currency. Every second you spend obsessing over somebody's opinion is a second they successfully collected from your life. And you're not handing out free time anymore. So when they expect an explosion and you give them, cool, don't misunderstand what happened. You didn't lose the argument. You refused to become part of it. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is look at the chaos someone created, realize it has nothing to do with your future, and calmly decide that you have better things to build than a reputation inside somebody else's little drama. You know what really bothers people who are addicted to your reaction? Silence. Not because silence is loud, but because it gives them nothing to work with. They can't twist a quiet response. They can't argue with a person who refuses to enter the argument. They can't manipulate someone who has stopped explaining every decision they make. And that's when they start getting uncomfortable, because suddenly the game they thought they controlled doesn't have a player anymore. They wanted drama. You gave them silence. They wanted an explanation. You gave them a shrug. They wanted you to prove that you cared. You looked at them and said, cool. And somewhere inside that tiny response was something they never expected. You were no longer emotionally available for their nonsense. That changes everything. Because some people don't actually want an answer from you. They want access to you. They want access to your emotions, your attention, your time, your confidence. They want to say something and watch it affect your entire mood. They want to make one little comment and spend the rest of the day knowing you're thinking about it. That's their victory. Not because they defeated you, but because they occupied space inside your mind without paying rent. And you finally stopped letting them live there. Silence becomes powerful when it is intentional. When you aren't silent because you're scared to speak, but because you've decided that speaking would be a waste. There's a difference between having nothing to say and realizing that not everything deserves a response. That difference is maturity. That difference is discipline. And once you understand it, you stop treating every provocation like an emergency. They say something disrespectful. You don't jump. They question your choices. You don't rush to defend yourself. They make assumptions about your life. You don't interrupt their fantasy. They try to embarrass you. You don't perform for the audience. You just keep moving. And that drives certain people insane because they were counting on your emotional participation. They created the stage, wrote the script, invited the audience, and expected you to show up angry. But you never agreed to the performance. So now they're standing there talking to themselves. That's the funny part. The moment you stop reacting, they often become louder. They might try harder. They might test another boundary. They might suddenly become extremely interested in what you're doing. They may start asking mutual friends questions. They may suddenly notice your progress after ignoring you for months. Not because you became valuable overnight, but because your attention disappeared. And people often recognize the value of access only after access is gone. You don't need to punish them. You don't need revenge. You don't need to make a public announcement about how you've outgrown them. Just remove the invitation. There is something strangely powerful about becoming unavailable to chaos. You wake up and realize you don't have to answer every message immediately. You don't have to defend every choice. You don't have to correct every rumor. You don't have to convince people who have already decided what they want to believe. Let them believe it. If somebody wants to misunderstand you, give them room. If somebody wants to underestimate you, let them. If somebody thinks your quietness means you're finished, don't interrupt their conclusion. Because while they're busy creating a story about you, you can be creating a reality that makes the story irrelevant. That's the difference between attention and progress. Attention asks, what are they saying about me? Progress asks, what am I building? Attention keeps checking the room. Progress keeps checking the work. Attention needs applause. Progress can survive in silence. And once you choose progress, you become less predictable. You stop announcing your next move. You stop telling everyone your plans. You stop explaining why you disappeared. You stop giving people a front row seat to every decision you make. Not because you're hiding, because you're focused. There's a certain kind of person who becomes nervous when they can't figure you out. They were comfortable when they knew exactly what would make you angry. They knew what would make you defensive. They knew which subject would pull you into an argument. Then you changed. Now they throw the same bait into the water and nothing happens. Again. Nothing, again, nothing. Eventually they have to ask themselves why you aren't biting anymore. And that question is where their control begins to disappear. Because your silence forces them to confront their own behavior without the distraction of your reaction. You don't have to expose them. You don't have to destroy them. You don't have to explain their motives to everyone. People reveal themselves eventually. Give them enough time. Give them enough freedom. Give them enough opportunities to repeat the behavior. And eventually the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Your job isn't to drag the truth into the room kicking and screaming. Your job is to stop getting in the way of it. So when somebody tries to pull you back into the old version of yourself, remember how much effort it took to become calmer. Remember how many times you had to learn that every insult doesn't require a response. Every accusation doesn't require a defense. Every disagreement doesn't require a winner. Sometimes the smartest move is to look at the situation, recognize exactly what it is, and refuse to give it the emotional energy it was designed to steal. They thought your calm meant they had won. That was their first mistake. They saw you standing there without arguing, without raising your voice, without desperately trying to prove yourself, and they made the easiest assumption in the world. You must be weak. Funny how people confuse control with weakness. They understand anger because anger is obvious. They understand shouting because shouting gives them something to fight. But calm makes insecure people uncomfortable because they can't tell what's happening behind it. They wanted you emotional. You stayed composed. They wanted you defensive. You stayed focused. They wanted you to start explaining yourself to everyone in the room. But you realized something very simple: if somebody has already decided to misunderstand you, your explanation is just entertainment for them. So you stopped, and suddenly your silence looked different. At first, they probably laughed about it. They thought you were backing down. They thought you didn't have an answer. They thought maybe they had finally found the pressure point that would make you fold. So they kept pushing. Another comment, another little insult, another attempt to make you react. Nothing. That's when calm becomes dangerous. Not dangerous because you're trying to hurt anybody. Dangerous because you've stopped being easy to control. You don't need to threaten people. You don't need to intimidate them. You don't need to make some dramatic speech about how powerful you are. You simply stop allowing somebody else's behavior to dictate your behavior. That is a completely different kind of strength. Anybody can lose their temper. Anybody can slam a door. Anybody can type an angry paragraph at 2 in the morning. Anybody can say something they regret because their emotions got there before their judgment. But can you sit there while somebody is trying to provoke you and still think clearly? Can you hear disrespect without immediately turning it into war? Can you walk away from an argument even when you know you could win it? Can you allow somebody to believe they got the last word without needing to chase after them? That requires discipline, and discipline looks boring from the outside. That's why people underestimate it. They see you working quietly and think nothing is happening. They see you refusing to respond and think you have nothing to say. They see you leaving the room and think you lost. Meanwhile, you're making decisions they can't see. You're choosing where your energy goes. You're choosing who gets access to your attention. You're choosing what deserves a response and what deserves nothing more than a quiet, cool. And then something strange happens. Your results begin speaking for you. You don't have to tell people you're changing when your habits already show it. You don't have to announce that you're becoming disciplined when your consistency becomes impossible to ignore. You don't have to tell people you're focused when you stop appearing everywhere they expect you to be. People notice absence, especially when they were used to having access to you. The person who once knew how to ruin your entire day suddenly can't. The person who used to make you question yourself suddenly has no influence. The person who expected you to explain every move suddenly gets nothing. And now they're confused. What happened to you? Nothing happened. You just stopped giving them control. That's all. You finally realize that not every battle deserves your best energy. Some arguments are designed to keep you distracted. Some people don't want resolution, they want engagement. They don't care whether they're right. They care whether they can keep you emotionally involved. And once you see that pattern, you stop feeding it. You don't need to expose every person who behaves badly. Sometimes you just need to observe. Watch what they do when they don't get the reaction they wanted. Watch how quickly their personality changes when you stop giving them attention. Watch how they suddenly become louder when your silence refuses to cooperate. That tells you everything, because people reveal themselves when they lose control of the situation. And you don't have to help them hide it. Let them talk. Let them assume. Let them underestimate. There is freedom in allowing people to have the wrong opinion about you. Think about that. You don't have to correct every misunderstanding. You don't have to prove your intelligence. You don't have to prove your loyalty. You don't have to prove your worth. If your entire sense of identity depends on convincing everyone that you're valuable, you've already handed them too much power. Your job is not to convince the world. Your job is to become someone whose actions make the argument unnecessary. That's why your calm matters. It protects your judgment. It protects your time. It protects your future. Because every emotional reaction has a cost. Sometimes the cost is a relationship. Sometimes it's an opportunity. Sometimes it's your reputation. Sometimes it's simply 3 hours of your life spent replaying a stupid conversation with someone who forgot about it 10 minutes later. You can't build a serious future while constantly fighting imaginary battles in your head. So you learn to pause. You learn to breathe. You learn to watch. You learn to decide. And when somebody tries to pull the old version of you out of hiding, they find something different standing there. Not colder, not crueler, just harder to manipulate. You don't need to destroy the person who underestimated you. You don't need to embarrass them. You don't even need them to admit they were wrong. Keep your composure. Keep your standards. Keep your work moving. Because sometimes the person who looks weakest in the moment is actually the only person in the room who has enough control to choose what happens next. And when you finally understand that your calm was never an absence of power, but the evidence that you no longer needed to prove you had any power at all, you didn't destroy their reputation. You didn't need to. That's the part people never understand when they're desperate to make you look like the villain. Sometimes you don't have to expose anybody, attack anybody, or tell the world what they did. You simply step back and let a person continue being exactly who they are. Give people enough time, and they will eventually introduce themselves better than you ever could. You see, reputation is a strange little thing. People can control a story for a while. They can edit conversations, leave out details, play innocent, blame somebody else, and convince a few people that they were the victim. And maybe you could fight it. Maybe you could gather screenshots, explain every detail, defend every accusation, and spend your nights trying to make everyone understand your side. But why? Why spend your peace proving something that time is perfectly capable of revealing? So you stopped. You didn't chase the rumors. You didn't create a counterattack. You didn't stand in the middle of the room screaming, "You don't know the truth." You just watched. And that silence probably confused them, because they expected you to fight back. They expected you to become emotional enough to make a mistake. They expected you to say something that could later be used against you. But you gave them nothing, so they kept talking. And that's where things became interesting. Because when somebody is determined to control the narrative, they eventually start talking too much. First it's one version, then another, then another. Eventually the details don't match anymore. The people around them begin noticing little inconsistencies. Not because you exposed them, but because they couldn't maintain the performance forever. That's the funny thing about pretending. It requires maintenance. The truth doesn't. You can memorize a lie today, but tomorrow you have to remember what you said yesterday. You have to remember who heard it. You have to remember which details you changed. You have to keep protecting the image. Meanwhile, you're just living, working, improving, staying out of the noise. And every day that passes makes the difference more obvious. You don't need to ruin somebody who is already ruining themselves through repeated choices. If they constantly disrespect people, eventually people notice. If they constantly betray trust, eventually people stop trusting them. If they constantly manipulate situations, eventually people learn to recognize the pattern. You don't have to announce the pattern. You just have to stop standing in front of it. And maybe that's what bothered them most. You didn't become their enemy. You became unavailable. You stopped giving them access to your time. You stopped defending yourself against every accusation. You stopped trying to make them understand your intentions. You stopped participating in conversations where your name was the main entertainment. You simply moved. And movement is powerful because it leaves people with their own behavior. They can't blame you for every consequence when you're no longer there. They can't say you caused the distance when you stopped chasing. They can't say you destroyed the relationship when you stopped accepting disrespect. They can't say you attacked their reputation when you never opened your mouth. Eventually, people start connecting the dots themselves. That's when the story changes. Not because you controlled it, because reality became louder than the performance. So don't become obsessed with proving somebody wrong. That obsession still gives them control. Every hour you spend thinking about how to expose them is another hour they own. Let them talk. Let them tell their version. Let them celebrate their temporary victory. You have better things to do. Build your life so carefully that their opinion becomes irrelevant. Improve yourself so consistently that you don't need to announce the improvement. Keep your behavior clean enough that when people eventually see the full picture, you don't have to scramble for an explanation. And when their own choices finally catch up with them, don't celebrate too loudly. Just remember how badly they wanted you to react, and how powerful it became when you didn't. You know what happens when you stop competing with people who desperately need to compete with you. At first, they don't understand it. They keep checking for your reaction. They keep looking for signs that you notice them. They make little moves, little comments, little displays designed to remind you that they're still there. And you know what you do? Nothing. You keep walking. Because eventually you realize something almost ridiculous: you were never racing them in the first place. Some people need competition because competition gives them identity. They need someone to beat, someone to compare themselves with, someone to secretly watch while pretending they don't care. They measure their progress by your progress. If you're behind, they feel ahead. If you struggle, they feel successful. If you succeed, suddenly they need to prove that they're doing better. That's not ambition. That's insecurity wearing a suit. And you can spend years participating in that little game without realizing how much energy it steals. You check what they're doing. They check what you're doing. You compare numbers, achievements, attention, relationships, possessions, opportunities. One person moves, the other moves. One person posts, the other posts. One person wins, the other suddenly needs a bigger victory. It never ends, because competition based on ego has no finish line. So you stepped away, not because you couldn't compete, because you finally understood that you had nothing to prove. That decision can look strange from the outside. People might even think you gave up. They see you stop responding to their little challenges and assume you lost interest because you couldn't keep up. They don't realize you stopped looking sideways, and there is something powerful about looking forward. When you stop checking who is beside you, you start noticing where you're actually going. Your energy changes. Your priorities change. Your standards change. You stop asking, am I ahead of them? You start asking, am I better than I was yesterday? That question is much harder, because now there's nobody else to blame. You can't blame their success for your lack of progress. You can't blame their mistakes for your own. You can't use someone else as a measuring stick anymore. You have to look at yourself, and that's where real growth begins. You start working when nobody is watching. You start building habits that don't look impressive on social media. You start learning things that nobody applauds. You start choosing discipline over attention. Meanwhile, the person who was competing with you is still looking sideways. They're waiting for your next move. They're wondering why you're not responding. They're confused because the game only worked when you played. And now there's a problem. They are competing alone. Imagine spending all that energy trying to defeat someone who isn't even checking the scoreboard. That's the trap. You can't win against someone who refuses to make your game their life. They can criticize your pace. You keep moving. They can question your choices. You keep building. They can announce their achievements. You can congratulate them and return to your work. That last part is important. You don't need to hate people to outgrow them. You don't need jealousy to create distance. You don't need revenge to become successful. Sometimes the most mature response is simply, good for you, followed by getting back to your own life. Because their success doesn't subtract from yours. Their attention doesn't define your worth. Their opinion doesn't determine your direction. And their competition doesn't require your participation. There will always be somebody trying to turn life into a scoreboard. Let them. There will always be somebody trying to make your progress feel smaller. Let them. There will always be somebody watching you closely enough to notice every mistake, but strangely quiet about every improvement. Let them watch. Your job is not to perform for spectators. Your job is to build. And building requires focus. You can't focus while constantly checking the person beside you. You can't create something original while obsessing over somebody else's path. You can't become your strongest self while spending every morning wondering whether somebody else is ahead. So you walked away, quietly, no announcement, no dramatic goodbye, no speech about how you were done with the competition. You simply stopped participating, and that silence became its own message. Because when somebody realizes they can't provoke you into competing, they have to face the possibility that they were competing for nothing. That can hurt the ego. But that isn't your problem. You have a life to build. You have skills to sharpen. You have mistakes to correct. You have goals that don't care who is watching. And the more seriously you take that mission, the less interesting other people's games become. Eventually, you stop noticing who is trying to pass you. You stop checking who is talking. You stop wondering who approves. You stop measuring your life through somebody else's achievements. You become obsessed with the work itself. And that's when progress becomes dangerous to the old version of you. Because now you're not trying to beat anyone. You're trying to become someone you respect when nobody is watching. The funny part is, the person who wanted you to compete may still be looking over their shoulder, waiting for you to catch up, waiting for you to react, waiting for you to acknowledge the race they created inside their own head. You know what's funny about people who are desperate to control the story? They always assume you're going to help them. They expect you to react, defend yourself, explain every detail, chase every rumor, answer every accusation, and prove to everyone that you were right. They want you emotional because emotion makes you predictable. They want you angry because anger makes you careless. They want you desperate because desperation makes you reveal things you never needed to reveal. But sometimes the smartest move is the one that looks like no move at all. You simply stop. You stop explaining. You stop chasing. You stop arguing with people who have already made up their minds. And suddenly, time starts doing the work you were about to waste your energy doing. That's the thing about time. It doesn't care about your ego. It doesn't care who looked convincing in the first 5 minutes. It doesn't care who had the better speech, the louder voice, or the bigger audience. Time has a very annoying habit of revealing patterns. People can fake something once, they can fake it twice, but eventually behavior repeats, and repetition tells the truth. Someone can pretend to be loyal while everything is going well. Someone can pretend to be respectful when everybody is watching. Someone can pretend to be innocent when the pressure is low. But give them enough time, enough situations, enough opportunities, and eventually the mask becomes too expensive to maintain. You don't have to pull it off. You just have to stop helping them keep it on. That's why doing nothing can be so powerful. Not passive nothing, intentional nothing. The kind of nothing where you choose not to respond because you know exactly what the response would cost you. You know the argument would become another argument. You know the explanation would create 3 more questions. You know the person isn't searching for truth, they're searching for something they can twist. So you give them nothing. And they start filling the silence themselves. They talk more, they explain more, they contradict themselves, they reveal their intentions. They create new stories to protect the old stories. And you're just sitting there watching the entire performance collapse under its own weight. That's the strange beauty of patience. It allows people to become their own evidence. You don't need to tell everyone what someone is like if they keep showing everyone what they're like. You don't need to expose dishonesty when dishonesty keeps repeating itself. You don't need to convince people that someone is unreliable when they eventually experience the unreliability themselves. You don't need revenge, you need distance. Because distance gives you perspective. When you're standing inside the chaos, everything feels urgent. Every message feels important. Every accusation feels like something you must answer immediately. Every rumor feels like a fire you have to put out before it spreads. But step back. Take one breath, then another. Ask yourself, will this matter 6 months from now? Sometimes the answer is no. And if it won't matter 6 months from now, why are you sacrificing your peace today? That doesn't mean you ignore serious problems. It means you learn the difference between protecting yourself and protecting your image. Those are not the same thing. Your image can survive misunderstanding. Your peace cannot survive constant obsession. So you let people think what they want. You let them celebrate their little victories. You let them believe their version of the story. You don't interrupt. Because you're playing a longer game, and longer games require patience. The person who needs immediate validation will always struggle against someone who can wait. They need applause today. You can work quietly for years. They need everyone to believe them immediately. You can let reality arrive slowly. They need to win every conversation. You can lose an argument and still win your life. That's the difference. You stop trying to win moments and start protecting your future. And eventually something happens. People notice. They notice that you never changed your story. They notice that your behavior stayed consistent. They notice that you weren't running around explaining yourself. They notice that the person who talked the most kept creating problems while you kept moving forward. Now the question becomes uncomfortable. If you were really the problem, why did everything continue getting better after you left? If you were really the one causing all the chaos, why does the chaos keep following the same person? You don't have to answer those questions. Let other people answer them. That's the part you need to understand. You are not responsible for controlling everyone's perception of you. You are responsible for controlling your behavior. Stay consistent, stay disciplined, stay focused. Let your actions accumulate, because one good day proves almost nothing. One calm response proves almost nothing. One successful decision proves almost nothing. But months of consistency, years of the same standards, that becomes evidence. And evidence is difficult to argue with. So when somebody tries to drag you into a battle that only benefits them, pause before you react. Maybe you don't need the perfect comeback. Maybe you don't need the last word. Maybe you don't need to prove that you saw through them. Maybe you just need to step away and let their own choices continue speaking. Because people eventually become what they repeatedly practice. If they practice disrespect, they become known for it. If they practice dishonesty, trust disappears. If they practice manipulation, people become cautious around them. If they practice chaos, eventually nobody wants to stand near them. And you keep your hands clean. You keep your focus forward. You let time move. You let reality breathe. You don't rush the ending because you understand something most people learn far too late. When you stop interfering with the consequences of someone's own behavior, you give reality enough space to finish the story they started. And while they're still trying to control what everyone thinks, you're already too busy becoming someone who no longer needs to explain why you walked away.